Okay, in this next section, this next couple of sections, we're going to move to the four C's of early Christianity. And these are Christology, or who Christ is, the Nicene Creed, so the statements of belief in early Christianity, the clergy and church organization, so these are how church works and who's in charge, and then finally to the canon. I'm actually going to begin with the New Testament, with this fourth one, the canon. The New Testament formed in a really kind of an interesting way. We think of the Bible as this book, this whole thing, but remember it's made up in two parts: the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. In After the fall of Jerusalem, Jewish leaders that were surviving got together, and they actually came up with what they felt was the canon, the rule, or the books that they really thought were scripture, and the ones that were the most important to study and to apply to life. The word canon just means a ruler, something that measures something else. And so that these books would be then set against the life of the individual believer or of the local community, synagogue community, to decide whether that believer or the community was measuring up to Scripture, to the Bible. And so the Jewish leaders came together and created what they understood to be the Hebrew Bible. And then Christians took up that same Hebrew Bible in the Greek rather than the Hebrew, and use that as their Old Testament, and that continues until today. Well, the New Testament is something that's being written from a few years after the time of Jesus until maybe the end of the first century. And so that collection of books is what I just want to talk about briefly. So we have four different kinds of sections in the New Testament, and they are really five, I guess. And so we want to talk about the Gospels. The Gospels are the first four books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And maybe opening a Bible right now or a Bible on screen would help you to understand this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are four accounts of the life of Jesus. They're different kinds of accounts, and they tell the story in a little bit different way. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are closer to each other than John is to them. But they basically tell the same story of the birth of Christ, or the beginning of Jesus' teaching in the community. And then there's this sort of tension that builds. Jesus says things that are viewed as more and more dangerous. And then finally it comes to a climax where powerful people are involved in the death of Jesus. And then right after that, there's this weekend of sorrow where people mourn the death of Jesus, all his disciples and followers. And then on the Sunday morning, the first day of the week, he raises from the dead. So each of these Gospels follow that pattern in one way or the other. And they include a number of stories about things that Jesus said and stories about things that Jesus did. So his teaching and his miracles. And so they become the texts that tell us about the life of Jesus. And they really remain of what we have left over, most of the stories that we have of Jesus. There's another history book, the book of Acts, and that tells the story of early Christianity from just after the death and resurrection of Jesus until the mid-60s, when Paul and Peter are assassinated in Rome. And it really follows their stories, Peter and Paul. It's really largely about them and the people around them. A third section are the letters of Paul, one of the earliest Christian leaders who weren't involved in that tight-knit disciple of Jesus movement. And there's 13 letters of Paul, and each of them are addressed to either individual churches or to some of the people that were involved in ministry with him. Paul would travel around the Mediterranean teaching and encouraging people, and he would occasionally have to write letters when people needed some more support, or they needed some teaching, or they were just frankly getting things wrong. Some of these are really long letters for the period, although they're only maybe 15 Bible pages, and some of them are quite short, which would be much more like a letter is. There are other letters in the New Testament that aren't by Paul. These are letters by people like Peter and James and John that are there to set into place and encourage in much the same way as Paul's letters. So each of these letters, the 15 to 20 letters that we have in the New Testament, they are encouragement to local believers and sometimes encouragement to a large believer group throughout the New Testament world. And then there's also, finally, the book of Revelation. Now, this is sort of a famous book. People get pretty upset and excited over this book, and there's lots of predictions and people trying to read it. It's a really weird and peculiar book. It's an apocalypse, a very special genre of Jewish literature. And some think it's all about the future, some think it's all about the past, and some think that it's telling the whole Christian story from the beginning to the end, telling it in a couple of different ways. It's a really intriguing book, and it actually finishes off the New Testament in the same way that the book of Isaiah ends, with God coming and being the people, the God of the people, and comforting them, wiping away tears, and actually bringing together a community for celebration and a community of joy. And so that's really how it ends. And so there's this sort of narrative arc in the Christian Bible as a whole, from creation and fall, and then attempts at redemption again and again and again, and then finally with the book of Revelation. Now, these letters and books were moving around the Mediterranean world for that first 100 years or so after Jesus. But when some people started kind of saying odd things about life and about what the church was and these sorts of things, particularly a fellow named Marcion, he had this idea of Gnosticism, so that matter, the stuff that everything is made of, is evil, and then spirit is good. And he had this idea, and he brought Christianity into that idea, and they don't fit very well, right? Because remember, God makes a good world and puts people in the world intentionally. And so it doesn't really make a fit. But Marcion's teaching, and what Marcion did was picked up a number of the letters of Paul, about 10 of them, including one that we don't have now, maybe. And then the parts of the book of Luke, he kind of edited things out. And this made other Christians uncomfortable, quite apart from the things he was teaching. And so what they decided to do in the mid-2nd century, about 150, is they actually got together and started to think about what we see as the Bible, what we see as the New Testament. And as they did that, they created the beginning of a canon. This one had about 21 letters, and it would grow over the next couple of centuries, 21 books, and it would grow over the next couple centuries to there were about 30 different books that could end up in the New Testament. A couple, the first letter to Clement of Rome, the Epistle of Barnabas, and the Didache were early contenders for it, and decided ultimately that they wouldn't stay in the New Testament, in the canon. Remember the rule, what we think of as the Bible. And there were really 3 questions that people used to decide. One, are the books ancient? Do they go to the first generation of Christians? And the letter of Clement to Rome is not actually that ancient. We know when it's written, the mid-90s, and he's not one of those early disciples, even though he's a bishop of Rome. Are they apostolic? So are they either written by an apostle or by the discipleship team of an apostle, his leaders, the people with him? And that's so they need to come from Peter or Paul or James or one of those early leaders, or from one of their disciples. And then the third thing, are the books universal? Are they read both in the East and the West, and the North and the South of the church? Are they read by Greek-speaking communities and by Hebrew-speaking communities and by Latin-speaking communities? Is it a global faith perspective? So, for example, a number of letters were left behind that were really just very particular to a time and place. And so those were the 3 questions. Are they apostolic? Are they ancient? Are they old? Are they from the apostles? And are they universal? Do they fit together? And so what happens is you get 27 books, the ones I listed, all kind of emerge as the Bible over the next 2 or 3 centuries. And it was in the 4th century, after Constantine, that finally we have a really very fixed canon, a fixed series of books. Now, this Bible then is used then to create ideas, to teach about history, to help Christians who are in power think about how law should work or how they develop their communities. And it's also something that the church is always critiquing itself by. So Pope Francis will tell a story of Jesus in order to critique the way he thinks that the Catholic Church is growing. Or in the Catholic Church's theology, the Bible is used as part of developing their ideas. In Protestant circles, the Bible is actually at the foundation of what their faith is. In fact, they would say the word sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as their foundation for authority. And so they're always going back into the Bible to decide what it is that they believe, how they teach it, what kind of ethics, how do they live in the world. And when new questions come up, like environmentalism, they'll look through the Bible and find different ways of dealing with this. And so that's why you have, for example, the creation care movement within North American and English speaking Christian churches, Protestant churches, and they're environmentalists, and they're doing it because of the way that they understand the creation story, and then what Christians are supposed to do in the face of that. And the Bible also contains poetry, prayers, worship, encouragement, proverbs, lessons for daily life as well too. And so that's how Christians use the Bible. It's read in church services, and it's read devotionally by people every day as part of their Christian life. The next video that we're going to talk about will address the other 3 C's. We've done Canon, where we talk about the Bible, talk about Scripture. We'll look at Christology, who Christ is, and the Creed, and then clergy, church leadership in the next video.